Something was said to your soulmate recently that they were never prepared to hear, and for a moment they didn't know how to respond. It wasn't something they had been searching for. It wasn't a conversation they expected to have. In fact, they may have believed this part of your story was already understood and settled, but then someone unexpectedly mentioned something about you, and the moment those words reached them, their entire perspective began shifting. They became quiet because suddenly an old memory felt different. A moment they had once dismissed started carrying a completely different meaning. A silence they had interpreted one way suddenly made them wonder whether there had been another reason behind it. And the most unsettling part wasn't what they heard. It was how quickly their heart recognized that the information connected to something they had been secretly questioning for a very long time. They may have tried to continue the conversation normally, but internally they were replaying every word. Who knew this? Why had they never heard it before? And most importantly, why did hearing this truth make them think of you immediately? Your soulmate is beginning to realize that the story they believed they understood may have been missing one crucial piece all along. The conversation they heard did not simply give your soulmate new information. It forced them to reinterpret something they had believed for a long time. At first, they may have tried to brush it aside, telling themselves that one person's words could not possibly change everything they already believed about you. But the more they thought about what was said, the harder it became to dismiss. There was a detail in that conversation that connected directly to a memory they had never completely understood. They remembered a time when your behavior seemed confusing, when your silence felt like distance, or when something between you suddenly changed without an explanation. For a long time, they may have assumed they knew the reason. Perhaps they thought you didn't care enough, that you had chosen to move on, or that whatever connection existed between you had simply faded naturally. But now, they were beginning to question those conclusions. What if they had only been seeing one side of the story? What if there was something happening behind the scenes that they never knew about? The person who spoke to them may not have realized how deeply their words would affect your soulmate. They may have simply mentioned something casually, without understanding that they were opening a door your soulmate had kept closed for a very long time. Suddenly, old conversations started returning to their mind. They remembered your expressions, your reactions, the moments when you seemed to hold something back, and even the times when you walked away without explaining what you were truly feeling. Things that once looked random were beginning to feel connected, and that realization created an emotional conflict inside them because part of them felt relieved to finally have an explanation, while another part felt almost heartbroken that they hadn't known this sooner. They started wondering how many assumptions they had made based on incomplete information. They wondered whether they had judged your actions too quickly or mistaken your silence for indifference. The more they replayed the conversation, the more one particular thought kept returning. Why didn't anyone tell me this before? That question stayed with them because suddenly the past didn't feel as simple as it once had. There may have been reasons behind your actions that they never considered, circumstances you never explained, or feelings you kept hidden because revealing them felt too difficult at the time. Your soulmate is beginning to understand that sometimes two people can experience the same story while carrying completely different versions of what happened. One person sees silence and thinks rejection. The other experiences silence because they are afraid, overwhelmed, or protecting something they cannot yet explain. One person sees distance and assumes the connection is gone. The other may be quietly carrying the connection while trying to figure out what to do with it. And now, your soulmate is looking back at those moments with new eyes. They are not simply remembering what happened. They are questioning what they thought happened. That distinction is becoming incredibly important, because the truth they heard has created a crack in the story they had accepted for so long, and through that crack they are beginning to see something they were never supposed to overlook. You may have been carrying more than they ever realized. You may have felt more deeply than they assumed, and there may have been a reason you couldn't say everything when they expected you to. Your soulmate doesn't have every answer yet, but they know one thing now. The story they believed was complete was never complete at all. And the next detail they uncover may explain not only what happened between you, but why they were never truly able to stop wondering about it. Your soulmate kept returning to the same part of that conversation, almost as if their mind refused to let it go. They tried to continue with their day, to focus on other things, to convince themselves that perhaps they were giving too much importance to a few words, but something inside them had already changed. The information they heard had connected with too many memories to simply dismiss. They began remembering moments they had not thought about in a long time, and strangely, each memory seemed to carry a different meaning now. They remembered the times you appeared distant when they expected you to come closer. They remembered moments when you seemed emotional but said nothing. They remembered opportunities when something could have been said, but neither of you found the courage to say it. And suddenly, your soulmate began wondering whether those moments had ever been what they originally believed them to be. Perhaps they had mistaken your silence for a lack of feeling. Perhaps they had interpreted your distance as rejection when there was something much deeper happening beneath the surface. This realization affected them more than they expected because it forced them to question their own role in the story. They started asking themselves whether they had also contributed to the distance by making assumptions instead of asking questions. They wondered how many times fear had made them interpret something incorrectly, how many times pride had stopped them from seeking clarity, and how many times they had walked away simply because they didn't know what else to do. The unexpected truth had opened a door, and behind that door was an entirely different version of the past. Your soulmate could now see that the connection may have contained feelings neither of you knew how to express properly. They began recognizing patterns in your behavior that once seemed confusing. Small gestures suddenly appeared meaningful. Certain words suddenly sounded different. Even moments that ended in silence began to feel like conversations that had simply never reached their conclusion. And this was the part that stayed with them the most. They were beginning to realize that you may have been carrying your own truth quietly while they were carrying theirs. Two people could have been standing inside the same story, both feeling something, yet neither fully understanding what the other person was experiencing. The person who revealed the truth had unknowingly shown your soulmate that possibility, and once they considered it, they couldn't stop. They began wondering whether the connection had been affected less by a lack of emotion and more by misunderstanding, timing, fear, and everything neither of you knew how to say. That realization brought both relief and regret. Relief because some of the confusion finally had an explanation, but regret because they couldn't stop thinking about how different things might have been if they had known sooner. They started replaying the moments when they chose not to reach out, the conversations they allowed to end too quickly, and the feelings they pushed aside because admitting them seemed too risky. Now those choices looked different. They no longer seemed like simple decisions. They looked like moments shaped by incomplete understanding. And your soulmate was beginning to see something they had never wanted to admit. Maybe they hadn't truly moved on because some part of them had always sensed that there was more to the story. They just didn't have the information necessary to understand it. Now they did, and that changed the question completely. They were no longer asking whether you had ever mattered to them. They were beginning to ask whether you had been carrying a truth about this connection all along, and whether that truth was the one thing that could finally explain why neither of you had ever been able to completely leave the story behind. Your soulmate could no longer treat what they had heard as just another piece of information because it had reached somewhere much deeper than they expected. The more they thought about it, the more they realized that this wasn't only changing their understanding of you, it was changing their understanding of themselves. For a long time, they had believed that they knew why things unfolded the way they did. They had created explanations that helped them feel safe, even when those explanations were painful. If you were distant, they assumed you didn't care. If you became quiet, they assumed you had moved on. If the connection seemed to fade, they told themselves that perhaps it was never meant to become anything more. Those explanations allowed them to keep moving forward without having to confront the possibility that they might have misunderstood something important. But now those explanations were beginning to fall apart. The truth they heard had created questions that demanded honest answers. They started wondering how many decisions they had made based on assumptions instead of facts. They remembered moments when they wanted to reach out but stopped themselves. They remembered times when they wanted to ask what you were really feeling, but allowed fear to convince them that there was no point. They remembered opportunities when honesty might have changed everything, yet they chose silence because silence felt safer. And now, looking back, they could see that safety had come with a price. It had protected them from immediate vulnerability, but it had also left them with unanswered questions that followed them long after the moment had passed. This realization was difficult because your soulmate began understanding that perhaps the greatest obstacle between you was never a lack of feeling. Perhaps it was the absence of understanding. Two people could care deeply and still miss each other completely when fear, timing, pride, and assumptions stand between them. Your soulmate was beginning to understand that now. They also began thinking about the person who had revealed the truth and wondering why that person knew something they didn't. What had they seen? What had they noticed? How long had this truth existed without reaching them? Those questions made your soulmate realize that perhaps other people had noticed things about your connection that neither of you had been willing to acknowledge. And that thought was both unsettling and strangely comforting. It meant that what they had felt wasn't necessarily something they had imagined. There may have been something visible beneath the surface all along. Suddenly, the memories became more emotional. They remembered the moments when your eyes seemed to say something your words never did. They remembered the strange tension that appeared when one of you tried to hide how much the other mattered. They remembered how certain encounters could affect their entire mood long after they ended. At the time, they didn't know what those reactions meant. Now they were beginning to understand. And with that understanding came a painful question. What if they had known this sooner? What if they had approached you differently? What if they had trusted what they felt, instead of immediately searching for reasons to doubt it? Your soulmate couldn't change those moments, and that realization brought a quiet sadness. But beneath the sadness was something else, clarity. They finally understood why this connection had remained in the back of their mind, despite everything that happened afterward. It wasn't because they were incapable of moving forward. It was because a part of the story had never made sense to them. Now someone had unknowingly handed them the missing context, and they could no longer pretend they hadn't heard it. The truth had changed the past in their mind, but more importantly, it was beginning to change how they viewed the future. And for the first time, your soulmate wasn't asking whether they should forget what they had heard. They were asking what they would do with it now that they finally knew. And now your soulmate is beginning to understand the truth in a way they never could before, because the words they heard have changed more than their opinion of the past. They have changed what the entire connection means to them. They can no longer look at those old moments and see only confusion, distance, or missed opportunities. They can see the emotions that were hidden underneath them, the circumstances neither of you fully explained, and the possibility that both of you were carrying pieces of the same story without realizing how deeply they were connected. The person who unexpectedly revealed the truth may never have understood the impact of what they said, but their words gave your soulmate something they had been missing for a long time: perspective. Suddenly, your soulmate understands why certain memories never completely disappeared, why certain questions continued returning, and why a part of them always felt that something about your story was unfinished. They realize that sometimes people don't remain in our thoughts because we are unable to let go. Sometimes they remain because there is still something meaningful we haven't understood. And that realization brings a strange sense of peace. Your soulmate is no longer trying to force the past into a simple explanation. They are finally allowing themselves to admit that you mattered more than they had allowed themselves to believe. They may also be realizing that the truth they heard doesn't automatically guarantee what happens next, and that is important. What matters is that their perception has changed. They now know something they cannot unknow. They have seen another side of the story, and that knowledge is forcing them to reconsider the choices they made, the feelings they buried, and the possibilities they once dismissed. They may wonder whether you ever knew how deeply certain moments affected them. They may wonder whether you were also waiting for clarity, whether you also misunderstood their silence, or whether you carried your own version of the truth without ever knowing that they were struggling with the same unanswered questions. Those thoughts may continue returning because there is now a new awareness between the past and the present. Your soulmate understands that they cannot go back and change every decision, but they can stop pretending that those decisions were based on the complete truth. And perhaps that is the real reason everything changed so instantly. It wasn't simply because someone told them something unexpected. It was because those words finally gave meaning to feelings they had never been able to explain. They now see that the connection may have been shaped by more than what was said aloud. It was also shaped by what remained unsaid, what was misunderstood, and what both of you were too afraid to reveal at the time. That understanding may cause them to become more honest with themselves than they have ever been before. Instead of asking whether they should keep ignoring the connection, they are beginning to ask what honesty would look like now. Instead of wondering whether the past mattered, they are accepting that it did. And instead of trying to convince themselves that everything was coincidence, they are finally allowing themselves to acknowledge the impact you had on their heart. The truth they heard didn't give them every answer, but it gave them the one thing they needed most to stop running in circles: clarity. And once someone finally receives clarity after carrying confusion for so long, they cannot return to the exact same version of themselves. Your soulmate has heard something they never expected to hear, and now they have to decide what that truth means for the future. Maybe the next chapter will begin with a conversation, maybe with a moment of honesty, or maybe simply with the courage to stop hiding from what they already know inside. But one thing has changed permanently. They can no longer look at your story the way they did before. The truth reached them when they least expected it. And now the question isn't whether everything changed. The question is what they will choose to do now that they finally understand why.